The first sign of a king's men was the silence. Not the hush of held breath, but the dead, heavy quiet that swallows all other sounds. The wind in the blighted pines, the whine of a hungry pup, the frantic beat of your own heart. Brynja felt it in her bones, a pressure building behind her eyes. She was kneeling in the thin, acidic soil of the garden patch, her fingers raw from trying to coax life from the dead earth. It was a fool's task, one given to the pack's lowest omega to keep her hands busy and her head down, to keep her from being seen. A scruffy, soot-colored pup whined at her elbow, nudging his wet nose into her palm. She had named him Soot, for he was all that was left of a hearth that had long gone cold. He was a runt, discarded, and therefore hers. In the Blackwood pack, the broken things always found their way to Brynja. She stroked his matted fur, her one small comfort in a life of sharp edges. Then the silence broke. Hoofbeats, heavy and deliberate, churned the mud path leading to the great hall. Not the frantic scrabble of their own half-wild ponies, but the confident tread of war horses shod in mountain iron. Brynja froze, her hand still on the pup's head. She could feel the vibration through the ground, a deep thrumming that promised change. Change was never good. For her, it had only ever meant a new kind of pain. Her cousin Isolde emerged from the hall. Tall and pale, with hair the color of bleached bone, she was the Alpha's heir, and she wore her power like a mantle of frost. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the clearing and found Brynja immediately. A faint, cruel smile touched her lips. "Still playing in the dirt, little mouse? Get up, you stink of failure." Brynja rose slowly, brushing the soil from her patched tunic. She did not speak. Words were a currency she could not afford to spend with Isolde. Soot growled, a pathetic little rumble deep in his chest. Isolde's gaze dropped to the pup, her lip curling. "And you keep that stray cur quiet, or I'll have its throat cut for the stew pot." The king's party came into view, 6 riders cloaked in gray wool that shed the persistent drizzle. Their banner was a stark silver wolf's head on a field of black, the crest of the Mountain King, who ruled from his fortress carved into the dragon's tooth peaks. The man at their head was colossal, broader in the shoulder than any 2 men of their pack. When he dismounted, the ground seemed to shudder. He swept back his hood, and the breath caught in Brynja's throat. It was the king himself, Valerius. His face was a map of old battles, a faint scar tracing the line of his jaw. His hair was black as a raven's wing, his eyes a startling, piercing gray that seemed to miss nothing. He was not handsome in the way of stories. He was terrifyingly real, a creature of stone and winter. He did not look at Isolde, who had arranged her face into a mask of regal welcome. Instead, his gaze swept the pathetic, huddled buildings of their settlement, the skeletal trees, the faces pinched with hunger. And then his eyes found Brynja. It was just for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable, not pity, not contempt, just a stillness, an assessment. She felt it like a physical touch and instinctively took a half-step back, pulling Soot behind her legs. The king's attention moved on, settling on Isolde as if he had only just noticed her. "Alpha Isolde," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly sound like rocks grinding together. It was not a question, it was a statement. "King Valerius," Isolde returned, her voice smooth as polished ice. "We are honored. Our lands are yours." A lie. They had nothing to give. "I have not come for your lands," the king said, his words clipped. "I have come for the gate." A tremor went through the assembled pack. The royal gate. The ancient sealed passage through the mountains that legend claimed led to untouched, fertile valleys. It had been shut for 500 years, the magic that powered it dormant, the stone deaf to all entreaties. Generations had been born and had died in its shadow, their hopes withering like the crops in their fields. Isolde smiled, a victor's smile. Of course, the prophecies are known to us. The gate will open only to the blood of the old line. She extended a pale, perfect hand, turning it slightly so a silver signet ring flashed in the gloom. My blood. Valerius looked at her hand, then back at her face. He said nothing. His silence was more damning than any argument. He seemed to be waiting, though for what, Brynja could not guess. One of his guards, a hard-faced man with a grizzled beard, took a step forward, his hand on his sword. Soot, sensing the tension, let out a sharp, frightened yip. The guard's head snapped toward the sound. "Silence that beast!" Before Brynja could react, he moved, his boot lashing out. She threw herself in front of the pup, taking the glancing blow to her hip. It sent a shock of pain up her side, but she barely registered it. She scooped Soot into her arms, holding him tight against her chest as he trembled. She glared at the guard, a flare of useless defiance in her eyes. "It is just a pup," she whispered, the words tasting of dust and fear. The guard sneered, but before he could speak again, the king's voice cut through the air, cold and absolute. "Yorn, enough!" The guard, Yorn, fell back instantly, his face shuddered. And then the king looked at Brynja again. He looked at her huddled on the ground, clutching a worthless stray, her cheek smudged with dirt. He looked at her not as if she were an omega, a piece of filth, but as if she were a puzzle he was just beginning to understand. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken things. He had seen her small, stupid act of courage, and something had shifted in the air between them. Then he turned his attention back to Isolde, his expression once more unreadable stone. "The ceremony," he said. "Let us begin." Isolde led them toward the clearing where the gate stood, a towering arch of black, seamless stone set into the mountainside. It was covered in swirling carvings that seemed to shift in the periphery of your vision. A sense of immense, sleeping power radiated from it, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. A ceremonial dais had been erected, and on it sat a silver bowl and a small obsidian knife. Isolde ascended the steps as if she were mounting a throne. She was magnificent in her certainty, her pale hair a beacon in the gray light. She believed her own story. Brynja, forgotten at the edge of the crowd, clutched Soot to her chest and prayed for it to be over. Isolde raised her hand over the bowl. A hush fell. With practiced grace, she drew the obsidian blade across her palm. A line of crimson welled, and she let the drops fall, one by one, into the silver basin. They landed with a soft hiss. The pack held its breath. The king watched, his face impassive. Nothing happened. The gate remained dark, silent, utterly indifferent. The wind soughed through the dead trees. Isolde's composure began to crack. She squeezed her fist, letting more blood spill, a desperate offering. Still, nothing. A murmur rippled through the pack, disappointment, sharp and bitter. Isolde's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. She whirled on the king. "It is a trick! Your presence interferes with the old magic!" Valerius did not so much as blink. The gate does not lie. In the ensuing chaos, as Isolde's followers tried to salvage her dignity and the crowd began to disperse in confusion, someone shoved Brynja from behind. She stumbled forward, her feet tangling. She fell hard against the edge of the dais, her hands thrown out to break her fall. Her right palm scraped against a jagged shard of rock that had broken from the base of the gate itself. Pain, sharp and clean, shot up her arm, a deep gash, bleeding freely. And then the world went silent. A low hum started, a vibration that came not through the ears, but through the soles of her feet, through the very marrow of her bones. A pale silver light began to bleed from the cracks in the gate, tracing the ancient carvings. The air grew thick, smelling of ozone and wet earth, and something else, something ancient and wild. Everyone froze. All eyes turned from the humiliated Isolde to the Omega bleeding at the foot of the dais. Brynja stared at her hand, at the blood welling from the cut. It was her blood, her worthless Omega blood that was making the gate sing. Isolde let out a strangled cry of rage, her eyes promising murder. She took a step toward Brynja, her hand clenched into a fist, but before she could move further, a huge shadow fell over Brynja. King Valerius was there. He had not moved toward the glowing gate. He had moved to stand between Brynja and her cousin. He looked down at Brynja, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly, deliberately knelt. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a strip of clean, white linen. He did not touch her. He did not command her. He simply held it out, an offering in the space between them. He waited. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt, entirely separate from the gate's power, shot through her. She wrapped the linen around her bleeding palm, the simple act a shield against the 100 pairs of eyes staring at her. When she looked up, Valerius was still watching her. "You will come with me," he said. Not a request, a fact. He rose to his full, intimidating height and faced the stunned and furious pack. "She is under my protection now." The mountain fortress was a thing of brutalist beauty, all sharp angles and gray stone clawed from the peak of the world. It felt less like a castle and more like a scar, a place where the mountain had been wounded and had healed into something hard and unforgiving. Wind screamed past the arrow slits, a constant, lonely cry. Brynja had never felt so small, so exposed. She was housed in a small, clean chamber with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto a sheer drop. The air was thin and cold, and it tasted of snow and iron. Soot, who had been grudgingly allowed to accompany her, stayed pressed against her legs, a small, warm anchor in this vast, cold place. They treated her like a key, a peculiar, blood-soaked key they didn't quite trust. The king's soldiers watched her with suspicion. The servants left food outside her door and scurried away before she could open it. Only Valerius himself spoke to her, and his words were few, precise, and offered no comfort. He brought her to a chamber near the heart of the fortress, where a fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. 2 other people were there. One was the gruff guard from the ceremony, Yorn. He stood by the fire, arms crossed over his massive chest, his expression one of open hostility. The other was an old woman, Maeva, her face a web of fine lines, her eyes dark and knowing. She was the fortress's seer, its healer, its keeper of lore. She looked at Brynja not with hostility, but with a weary, assessing curiosity, as if she were a particularly troublesome herb Maeva had to identify. "This is the one?" Maeva's voice was dry as autumn leaves. "Her blood woke the gate," Valerius stated. "Blood can be a trickster," the old woman murmured, her eyes lingering on the bandage on Brynja's hand. "It remembers slights. It holds grudges." Suddenly, a small movement from the shadows near the hearth caught Brynja's eye. A boy, no older than 6 or 7, with Valerius's black hair and a pale, haunted face. He was clutching a small, carved wooden bird, his knuckles white. He stared at Brynja with wide, terrified eyes, then shrank back into the shadows as if expecting a blow. He didn't make a sound. "Finn," Valerius said, his voice softening by a fraction of a degree. It was the first hint of warmth Brynja had heard from him. The boy, Finn, did not respond. He just clutched his bird tighter. Soot, sensing the child's fear, gave a soft whine. He trotted forward, his tail giving a tentative wag. He stopped a few feet from the boy and sat, looking at him with intelligent, patient eyes. Finn's gaze shifted from Brynja to the pup. His fear seemed to lessen, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on the small, scruffy dog. "The boy does not speak," Jorn grunted, his voice rough. "Hasn't for a year." Maeva shot Jorn a sharp look. "He will when he has something to say." Her attention returned to Brynja. "The king believes you can open the passage. Our scouts report the blight in your lands is spreading. It moves like a rot, consuming the soil, poisoning the water. Soon it will reach the foothills. Then it will climb the mountain. We are starving, girl. That is the truth of it. The king's larders are low. The hunting is thin. This fortress will become a tomb if that gate does not open." This was the first real explanation she had received. Not a prophecy, not a legend, but the grim reality of survival. She was not a chosen one. She was a last resort. Valerius had been watching the silent exchange between his ward and her pup. He looked at Brynja, his gray eyes intense. "Maeva will teach you the lore. You will learn what the gate requires. You are not a prisoner here, but you will not leave. Not until the way is open." His words were a cage built of necessity. She was their hope and their captive. Brynja looked from the silent, powerful king to the suspicious guard, the wise old woman, and the silent, broken boy. She felt a familiar despair, the certainty that she was, as always, utterly alone. But then she looked at Soot, who had crept closer to Finn and was now allowing the boy to tentatively touch his head. A small, fragile bridge being built in the heart of the cold stone fortress. For the first time, Brynja felt not just fear, but a spark of something else. A stubborn, foolish determination. She had survived Isolde. She would survive this. She met the king's gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Mornings were spent with Maeva in a dusty, circular room at the top of a winding spire, a place she called the Ocularium. It was filled with star charts, ancient scrolls, and the scent of dried herbs and old parchment. Maeva was a demanding teacher. She did not coddle, she corrected. She spoke of the gate not as a door, but as a living thing, a confluence of earth magic and bloodlines that had been put to sleep, wounded by some long-forgotten betrayal. "Your blood did not simply turn a lock," Maeva explained one afternoon, her gnarled finger tracing a faded diagram of the gate's carvings. "It called to the magic within. It woke it from its slumber. But waking is not the same as healing. A woken beast in pain is more dangerous than a sleeping one." Brynja learned that her family line, the line Isolde had tried so hard to erase, had not been mere omegas. They had been wardens, keepers of the balance between the gate's power and the land. Her parents had not died of a fever as she'd been told. They had been found dead at the foot of the gate, their deaths blamed on a reckless attempt to steal its power. Brynja now understood it was a lie, a story crafted by Isolde's ambitious grandfather to seize control of the pack and sever the true wardens from their duty. The blight, Maeva theorized, was not a curse Brynja carried, but the land's sickness made manifest, a direct result of the gate's long, pained slumber and the absence of a warden's care. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, a legacy of failure and lies she had never known was hers. Her afternoons were her own. She spent them in the small, sheltered courtyard where Finn would sometimes sit. She never approached him directly. She would sit on a cold stone bench, Soot at her feet, and work on mending her worn tunic. The boy would watch her from a distance, his wooden bird always in his hand. He seemed drawn not to her, but to the quiet, unassuming presence of her pup. One day, as a thin, wet snow began to fall, Brynja noticed Finn was shivering, his cloak too thin for the mountain's chill. Without thinking, she shrugged off her own outer wrap, a coarse but thick wool shawl, and walked over to him. She didn't speak. She simply laid it gently over his small shoulders. He flinched at her closeness, but didn't pull away. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wide and searching. She gave him a small, hesitant smile and retreated to her bench. Later that evening, there was a knock on her chamber door. It was Valerius. He stood in the doorway, a massive silhouette against the torchlight of the hall. In his hands he held a new cloak. It was made of the same gray wool his own men wore, but it was lined with soft, dark fur. It was impossibly warm. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held it out. "I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's too much." "Finn is not shivering," he replied, as if that explained everything. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space, making it hard to breathe. He placed the cloak on her bed. His gaze fell to Soot, who was curled at her feet. "The boy, he spoke today." Brynja's head snapped up. "He asked the cook if the pup had eaten," Valerius continued, his voice carefully neutral, but she could hear the thread of awe woven through it. One sentence. The first in a year. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "He trusts you." It felt like a monumental admission. In this place of stone and suspicion, the trust of a broken child was a powerful thing. It was a language the king understood better than words. Brynja clutched her hands together, unsure what to say. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of his gratitude, his surprise. He had brought her here as a tool, a means to an end. But the boy, the pup, the quiet way she moved through his cold world, it was changing the equation. She was becoming something more, something he had not accounted for. He gave a stiff, formal nod and left as silently as he had come, leaving the warmth of the new cloak and an entirely new kind of tension lingering in the air. One night, Brynja was woken by a nightmare. The gate, screaming. The blight, crawling up her limbs like black vines, choking her. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cold sweat on her skin chilling in the frigid air. The fortress was silent around her, a tomb of sleeping stone. She couldn't stay in the small room. She needed air, space. She pulled the fur-lined cloak Valerius had given her around her shoulders and slipped out of her room, Soot padding silently at her heels. She found herself drawn to a part of the fortress she hadn't seen before, a wing where torches burned late into the night. She followed the light and found a vast, two-story library. Books and scrolls were crammed onto shelves that reached to the vaulted ceiling. And there, at a heavy oak table covered in maps and texts, sat the king. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply looked up from a crumbling scroll, his gray eyes shadowed with exhaustion. A half-empty goblet of wine sat at his elbow. The air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and something else. A deep, abiding grief. "You could not sleep," he stated. "A dream," she admitted, her voice small in the cavernous room. She hovered by the doorway, feeling like an intruder. "Come," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. It was an invitation, not a command. Hesitantly, she walked to the table and sat. Soot curled up at her feet, letting out a soft sigh. Valerius pushed the goblet toward her. She shook her head. He watched her for a long moment. "Maeva says you are learning quickly. She says you have an instinct for the old words." "I just feel them," Brynja confessed. "The gate. It feels like a wound, like it's in pain." A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. "It is." His voice was rough, dredged from a place of deep pain. It took my mate from me." The confession hung in the air, shocking in its raw honesty. Brynja held her breath, not daring to speak. "Her name was Lyra," he said, the name a ghost on his lips. "She was of the old blood too, ambitious, impatient. She believed she could force the gate open, seize the power within it for herself. She did not listen to the seers. She believed strength was all that mattered." He ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary and old. "She bled for it, just as Isolde did. But the gate was stronger. The backlash, it did not just kill her. It tore the life from her. And it wounded the gate in the process. It has been bleeding its power, its sickness into the land ever since. The blight began that day." Suddenly, so much became clear. His coldness was not a flaw. It was a wall built around a wound. His caution was the bitter lesson of loss. His fear for his people was tangled in the guilt of his own past. "Finn," Brynja whispered, understanding dawning. "He is her son." Valerius nodded, his eyes shut. "He saw it happen. He was just a child. He has not spoken of it since. He has not spoken at all until you came." The vast, silent library seemed to shrink, drawing them closer together into this shared circle of grief and revelation. Brynja looked at this powerful, broken man, and for the first time, she did not see a king. She saw a man shackled by his own history, desperate to save his people from a mistake that had cost him everything. Without thinking, moved by an impulse she didn't understand, she reached across the table. She didn't take his hand. She just laid her own, palm up, on the ancient wood next to his clenched fist, an offering, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. For a long moment, he did not move. He stared at her small, calloused hand, the faint white line of the scar from the gate stark against her skin. Then, slowly, deliberately, he unclenched his fist. He turned his hand over, and lightly, so lightly she almost didn't feel it, he brushed his fingertips against hers. It was not a caress, it was a question. A quiet, desperate admission of a loneliness so profound it had nearly turned him to stone. And in that single, fleeting touch, the foundation of their world shifted. The arrival of Isolde was announced not with trumpets, but with the sudden, sharp tension that gripped the fortress like a winter frost. She came with a small retinue, claiming diplomatic purpose, her face a mask of false concern. She said she had come to assist her poor, misguided cousin, to lend the strength of her own purer bloodline to the effort. It was a lie so blatant Brynja could almost taste its poison. Isolde moved through Valerius's court like a pale, beautiful snake. She whispered in the ears of lords and ladies, planting seeds of doubt. An Omega witch from the blighted swamps, a girl whose touch soured the milk and whose shadow frightened the horses. She painted Brynja as a usurper, a fraud who had somehow tricked the gate and the king. The court, already wary of the strange girl in their midst, began to look at Brynja with renewed suspicion, with fear. Even Jorn, who had started to treat her with a grudging respect, seemed unsettled by Isolde's venomous certainty. Brynja tried to ignore it, focusing on her studies with Maeva. She was beginning to understand. The gate didn't need to be forced, it needed to be healed. Lyra's violent ambition had been like a knife plunged into its heart. It needed a willing warden, someone to soothe its pain, not a conqueror to command it. The text spoke of a heart price, a willing sacrifice not of life, but of something deeply personal, a memory, a hope, a grief, something given freely to mend what had been broken. The confrontation came, as Brynja knew it must, in the courtyard. She was sitting with Finn, showing him how to weave a small bird from rushes. He was smiling, a rare and precious sight. Soot was dozing in a patch of pale sunlight at their feet. Isolde appeared in the archway, her silver dress shimmering. "How touching," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "The little witch plays with the broken prince." Finn shrank back, his smile vanishing. Brynja put a protective arm around his shoulders. "Leave him alone, Isolde." "I am merely concerned for his welfare," Isolde purred, advancing on them. "In the care of one who carries the blight in her very blood. Who knows what contagion you spread?" She reached for Finn, her fingers curled like talons. Before Brynja could react, Soot was on his feet, a low, vicious growl rumbling in his chest. He was no longer a pup, but a lean, half-grown wolf, and he placed himself squarely between Isolde and the boy. Isolde scoffed. "A mutt protecting a mute! How fitting!" She aimed a kick at Soot. "No!" Brynja cried, shoving Finn behind her and moving to block the blow. But she wasn't the one who intercepted it. A mountain of a man moved with surprising speed. Jorn caught Isolde's arm in a grip of iron. "That's enough, my lady." His voice was flat, his eyes cold with a dawning disgust. He had seen Isolde's cruelty for what it was, not political maneuvering, but pure, unadulterated malice aimed at a child. Isolde wrenched her arm free, her face contorted with rage. "You dare touch me? You will answer to the king." "He will answer to me now." Valerius stood in the archway. He had not raised his voice, but the quiet fury emanating from him silenced the courtyard. His gray eyes were chips of ice. He looked from Isolde's snarling face to Jorn's protective stance to Brynja shielding his terrified ward. He saw everything in a single, damning glance. "You have abused my hospitality," he said to Isolde, his voice lethally calm. "You have threatened a child under my roof. You will leave my lands by sunrise. If you are found within my borders after that, my guards will hunt you down like the rabid animal you are." Isolde's jaw dropped. She opened her mouth to argue, to weave another lie, but the look on his face stopped her. This was not the cold, distant king she had schemed to manipulate. This was a warlord, an alpha in his own territory, and she had pushed him too far. Without another word, she turned and stormed away, her dignity in tatters. The courtyard was silent in the aftermath. Jorn gave Brynja a short, meaningful nod and retreated. Brynja knelt, her hands on Finn's shoulders. He was trembling. She murmured soft words to him, stroking his hair, while Soot licked his hand. Valerius walked toward them. He stopped a few feet away, his big frame casting a long shadow. He watched her gentle the crying child, his expression unreadable but intense. He waited until Finn's sobs had quieted to a few shuddering breaths. Then he spoke her name, just one word, low and resonant. "Brynja." She looked up. The way he said it, it was not a summons. It was an acknowledgement, a vow. It held the weight of all the things he could not say. "Thank you. I see you. You are not what I thought you were." "He is not my son," Valerius said quietly, the confession costing him something. "Lyra, she took a consort before we were mated. Finn was the result. I claimed him as my own to protect him, to give him a name. I have tried to be a father to him, but it was always as penance for his mother's death, a duty, not love." He looked at the way Finn leaned into Brynja's side, seeking her comfort without reservation. "You," he said, his voice thick with a strange wonder. "You show him what it is, without trying." He took a step closer, and for the first time, he did not wait. He reached down and laid his hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, heavy, a brand of solid reality on her skin. It was not a gesture of ownership or command. It was a gesture of anchoring, as if he too were steadied by the contact. And Brynja, who had spent her entire life flinching from touch, did not pull away. She leaned into it. The blight was accelerating. Mava's scrying pools showed the black rot creeping up the mountain's base faster than anyone had predicted. The water in the fortress wells had begun to taste of metal and decay. There was no more time. The gate had to be opened now, or they would all perish in this stone tomb. They stood before it, a small, grim company. Brynja, Valerius, Mava, and Yorn. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with a pressure that made the ears ache. The gate hummed, its silver light pulsing faintly like a weak and struggling heart. Brynja could feel its pain as a tremor in her own bones. She knew what she had to do. The heart price. She had to give it a piece of herself. She had thought long and hard about what to give. Not a happy memory. She had too few of those to spare. Not her grief. That was a familiar cloak she wasn't sure she could survive without. She had decided on her fear. The deep, pervasive fear that had been her constant companion since childhood. The fear of being worthless, of being cast out, of being alone. It was the heaviest thing she carried. To give it away would be to unmake herself, to become someone new. It was terrifying. Valerius stood beside her, his presence a solid wall against the oppressive energy of the gate. He had not questioned her. He had not tried to offer another way. He trusted her judgment, her connection to this ancient power. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark with concern. "I will not lose you," he said. The words were quiet, almost rough, but they landed with the force of a battle cry. It was the closest he had ever come to saying what was in his heart. It was everything. She gave him a shaky smile. "You won't." She stepped forward, holding the small obsidian knife Mava had given her. She took a deep breath, focusing her mind, calling up the feeling she intended to sacrifice. She pictured Isolde's sneer, the averted eyes of her pack, the gnawing loneliness of her nights. She gathered all of it, a cold, hard knot in her chest. Then, she drew the blade across her palm. Blood, dark and warm, welled instantly. She pressed her hand flat against the cold stone of the gate. She closed her eyes and pushed the fear, all of it, out of herself, through her hand and into the stone. It was like tearing a part of her own soul away. An agony of emptiness ripped through her. She cried out, stumbling back. Valerius caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her upright. "I have you," he murmured into her hair, his voice a raw anchor in the storm of sensation. The gate responded. The low hum rose to a thundering crescendo. The silver light exploded, blindingly bright, pouring from every carved line. The stone itself seemed to become translucent, a curtain of light. A wind, smelling of damp earth, green grass, and blooming flowers, rushed out to meet them, a breath from a new world. It was working. The wound was healing. But from the shadows of the blighted trees at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. Isolde. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes wild with a feverish madness. She had not left. She had been hiding, waiting. "The power," she hissed, her voice cracked. "It is mine!" She lunged, not at the gate, but at Brynja, a shard of black rock in her hand. "You stole it from me!" Yorn roared and threw himself in her path, but Isolde was unnaturally fast, fueled by rage and envy. She dodged him, slicing his arm as she passed. He grunted in pain and fell to one knee. Isolde was almost upon Brynja. Valerius moved. He released Brynja and met her cousin's charge. He did not draw his sword. He simply became a wall of unyielding fury. He caught Isolde's wrist, his grip like a manacle of iron. The shard fell from her nerveless fingers. "No more," he snarled, his voice a low thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. And then the gate, now awake and whole, passed its own judgment. The pure, clean magic pouring from it sensed the violent, selfish intent in Isolde. A wave of silver light, gentle to the others, struck her like a physical blow. It didn't burn her, it simply unraveled her. It washed over her, and where it passed, she became transparent, a fading image of hate and ambition. She gave a final, silent scream and then was gone, dissolved into nothing by the very power she had sought to corrupt. The light from the gate softened, settling into a steady, welcoming glow. The passage was open. Before them lay a valley, lush and green under a sky of impossible blue. The air was clean, the world was new. Hope, real and tangible, was a scent on the wind. Brynja swayed on her feet, utterly spent, the emptiness inside her beginning to be replaced by a strange, light-headed peace. Valerius was at her side in an instant. This time, when he pulled her into his arms, it was different. There was no hesitation, no waiting for permission. It was a desperate, profound need. He buried his face in her hair, his large body trembling slightly. He held her as if she were the only thing holding his world together. And for the first time in her life, Brynja felt completely, utterly safe. She was no longer the lowest omega, the worthless stray. She was the warden. She was the key. And she was home. 2 years passed. The new land was as kind as it had promised. The people of the mountain fortress and what remained of the Blackwood pack had settled in the Green Valley, their hunger replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a good harvest. The blight was a memory, a story told to children to remind them of the price of greed. Brynja stood in her garden, her hands buried in the rich, dark soil. A small stone house stood behind her, its walls covered in climbing roses. It wasn't a castle or a great hall, just a home, solid and real, built near a clear, running stream. The air was warm, filled with the drone of bees and the scent of lavender. Soot, now a magnificent, full-grown wolf dog, lay sleeping in a patch of sun, his tail thumping against the ground in a contented dream. A peal of laughter made her look up. Finn, no longer a silent, haunted boy, but a bright, talkative 9-year-old, was chasing butterflies near the stream. He was happy. He was whole. The sight of it filled a space in Brynja's chest she hadn't even known was empty. The fear she had given to the gate had never returned. In its place, something new had grown, a quiet, steady joy. A shadow fell over her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Valerius came to stand beside her, his presence as familiar and comforting as the warmth of the sun. He was no longer dressed in the severe black and gray of a king. He wore a simple linen tunic, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, tanned forearms. He had spent the morning helping Yorn raise a new barn, and he smelled of sawdust and sweat. He was no longer just a king. He was a builder, a farmer, a man at peace. He held something out to her in his calloused palm. It was a small bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of pale birchwood, its wings outstretched as if in flight. It was just like the one Finn used to carry, a perfect copy, a memory of the past remade into a promise for the future. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at the carving, he looked at her. His gray eyes, once so cold and distant, were now filled with a warmth that was hers alone. He reached out, his large, gentle hand covering hers where it rested on the slight, firm curve of her belly. A new life stirred beneath their touch, a life conceived not in duty or prophecy, but in love. A quiet, unshakable love that had grown slowly, like a seed in good soil. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the quiet of the afternoon, with the sound of their child's laughter on the breeze and the solid weight of his hand over hers, Everything was said. They had walked through darkness and found the dawn. This was their earned peace, their fated refuge. This was home.